There is a very specific type of terror that comes from something that simply cannot happen. We are accustomed to tragedy, and we can process violence or accidents because they leave evidence behind. They leave a trail of cause and effect that our brains can understand. But what happens when the physical laws of our reality just seem to break? Imagine a room with only one door. You set up a camera pointing directly at that door. You watch a person walk through that door into the room. A few minutes later, you watch every single person inside that room walk back out. But the person you watched go in is not among them. You search the room, and it is completely empty. Where did they go? Did they dissolve into the air? Did they step into a crack in the universe? Ah. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what happened to a young man in Ohio, in a case that remains one of the most baffling, logically impossible mysteries ever recorded. Before we dive into the impossible vanishing of this young man, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2006. The city was Columbus, Ohio. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old, and on the surface, his life was moving in a brilliant direction. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a bright, handsome, and deeply intelligent young man with a promising future as a doctor. He had a beautiful girlfriend named Alexis, who was also a medical student, and they were deeply in love. In fact, Brian had recently purchased a ring and was planning to ask Alexis to marry him during an upcoming vacation they had booked to Miami, Florida. They were scheduled to fly out on a Monday, just a few days away. But underneath the surface of this perfect life, Brian was carrying a heavy, suffocating weight. Just 3 weeks prior to this story, Brian had lost his mother to a grueling battle with cancer. He had been incredibly close to her, and her death had left a massive, hollow void in his heart. He was trying to hold it together, pushing through his grueling medical exams and keeping a brave face for his family and Alexis. But the grief was a constant, heavy shadow following him everywhere. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, Brian finished his final medical exams for the quarter. It was the beginning of spring break. He and his father went out to dinner that evening. His father noticed that Brian looked exhausted. The late nights of studying, combined with the raw, unprocessed grief of losing his mother, were clearly taking a toll on him. His father told him he should just go home, get some rest, and pack for his trip to Miami. But Brian declined. He said he was going to meet up with his friend and fellow medical student, Clint, to celebrate the end of their exams. He needed a distraction. He needed to blow off some steam. Around 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. This location is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer impossibility of what was about to happen. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was located inside a large entertainment complex in the University District, but the bar was not on the ground floor. It was located on the second floor of the building. To get into the bar, you had to walk into the ground floor lobby and ride a long escalator up to the second level. At the top of the escalator, there was a small landing and then the main entrance doors leading into the bar. Most importantly, the building was equipped with security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling right outside the Ugly Tuna Saloon. This camera continuously panned back and forth, capturing the top of the escalator, the landing, and the front doors of the bar. It was the only public entrance and the only public exit. If you went into the bar, you were caught on that camera. If you left the bar, you were caught on that camera. Brian and Clint started their night at the Ugly Tuna. They had a few drinks, catching up and enjoying the loud, energetic atmosphere of the college crowd. After a while, they decided to do some bar hopping. They left the Ugly Tuna, went back down the escalator, and visited a few other establishments in the immediate area. They drank, they talked to friends, and they tried to drown out the heavy stress of the past few weeks. As the night wore on, they met up with a female friend named Meredith. The three of them continued their night out, eventually deciding to head back to where they started. At 1:15 a.m., early Saturday morning on April 1st, the security camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloon captured Brian, Clint, and Meredith riding the escalator back up to the second floor. The footage shows them clearly. They step off the escalator, walk across the landing, and disappear through the doors into the crowded bar. The bar was incredibly packed. The music was deafening, the air was hot and humid from hundreds of bodies pressing together, and the drinks were flowing. Clint and Meredith found a spot near the bar, but Brian told them he was going to walk around and see if he could find some other friends. He wandered off into the dense crowd, disappearing into the sea of people. Time slipped away. At 1:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before the bar was scheduled to close for the night, the security camera outside the entrance captured Brian once again. The footage shows Brian stepping out of the front doors of the bar. He walks onto the landing near the top of the escalator. He is talking to two young women. They stand there for a brief moment, chatting. Brian looks totally normal. He is not stumbling. He does not look distressed, and he does not seem to be in any kind of danger. He says goodbye to the two women. The women turn and walk toward the escalator to leave the building. Brian, however, does not follow them. The camera clearly shows him turn around, face the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and walk back toward the doors. He steps out of the frame, heading directly back into the bar. At 2 a.m., the harsh, bright, overhead lights of the Ugly Tuna Saloon turned on. The music abruptly cut off. The bartenders started shouting for everyone to finish their drinks and head toward the exit. It was closing time. Clint and Meredith were standing near the front, waiting for Brian. As the massive crowd began to funnel out of the doors and down the escalator, they kept their eyes peeled for their friend. They watched hundreds of college students shuffle past them. The crowd slowly thinned out until the bar was completely empty. The staff began wiping down the tables and sweeping the floors, but Brian never came out. Clint and Meredith checked the bathrooms. They were empty. They walked around the entire second-floor landing. Nothing. Clint tried calling Brian's cell phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and assuming that Brian had perhaps met up with someone else and left without telling them, or simply decided to walk home to his apartment, Clint and Meredith gave up. They walked down the escalator and went home. Saturday morning arrived. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, called him several times, eager to talk about their trip to Miami. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She thought it was slightly strange, but she figured he was just sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. As the day progressed into evening, and Brian still had not returned any calls from Alexis, Clint, or his father, a cold sense of unease began to settle over the family. Brian was not the type of person to completely ignore his phone, especially not with a major trip coming up. By Sunday, the unease had turned into pure panic. Brian had a flight to catch on Monday morning. He had not been home. His car was still parked at his apartment. His luggage was not packed. Monday morning came. Alexis stood at the airport departure gate in absolute agony, watching the passengers board the flight to Miami. She waited until the very last second, praying she would see Brian running down the terminal. But he never showed up. The plane doors closed, and the plane took off without him. At that exact moment, Alexis knew something was horribly wrong. The family immediately contacted the Columbus police and officially reported Brian Schaefer missing. The police launched an investigation, initially assuming this was a standard case of a young man who had perhaps wandered off and gotten into an accident. They requested the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, focusing entirely on the night of Friday, March 31st, and the early hours of Saturday, April 1st. The detectives sat in a dark room, watching the grainy footage. They saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith ride the escalator up at 1:15 a.m. They fast-forwarded. They watched the footage at 1:55 a.m. They saw Brian walk out, talk to the two women, turn around, and walk back toward the bar entrance. Then, the detectives watched the footage from 2 a.m. until the bar was completely empty. They watched every single person walk out of those doors and go down the escalator. They paused the tape, they rewound it, they watched it again. They focused on every face, every jacket, every gait. Brian Schaffer never walked out. The detectives were baffled. They thought they must have missed something. They implemented a painstaking manual counting process. They counted every single person who went up the escalator that night. Then they counted every single person who came down the escalator. The numbers did not lie. Every single person who went up that night came back down, except for one, Brian. How does a 27-year-old man vanish from a second-floor bar with only one public exit? The police immediately secured the building. They brought in highly trained search dogs. The dogs were given a piece of Brian's unwashed clothing to pick up his scent. The dogs tracked his scent through the ground floor lobby, up the escalator, across the landing, and into the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The dogs wandered around the bar floor, following his path through the crowd. But then, the scent just stopped. The dogs spun in circles, confused. They could not find a trail leading out. It was as if Brian had evaporated into thin air right there on the bar floor. The authorities began to look for alternative exits. If he did not go down the escalator, he had to have left through another door. The only other way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloona was a set of emergency service doors located in the back of the building. These doors were strictly for staff and deliveries. The police investigated the service doors. If Brian had somehow slipped through them without anyone noticing, he would have found himself in a chaotic, highly dangerous environment. The back of the building was a massive, active construction site. It was dark, filled with deep trenches, exposed rebar, concrete pillars, and steep drops. It was a labyrinth of scaffolding and debris. But there was a major problem with this theory. The service doors were not meant for public use. They were heavy, and they opened up to a route that was notoriously difficult to navigate even in the daylight. More importantly, the construction site was heavily monitored by motion-sensitive security cameras to prevent theft. The police pulled every single hour of footage from the construction site cameras for that entire weekend. They watched the tapes, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow, any sign of a person stumbling through the dark. The motion sensors were never tripped. The cameras captured absolutely nothing. Furthermore, police scoured the entire construction zone. They brought the tracking dogs through the debris. They looked down every trench and inside every concrete pipe. They found zero physical evidence that anyone had been there. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no footprints in the mud. The situation was entirely impossible. He did not leave through the front. He did not leave through the back. He was not inside the bar. Desperation set in. Prevent. The police theorized that perhaps Brian had changed his clothes to disguise himself and slipped past the front camera. They meticulously interviewed every single person who was in the bar that night. They tracked down the two women he was seen speaking to at 1:55 a.m. The women confirmed they spoke to him briefly, said goodbye, and left. They had no idea where he went afterward. They checked Brian's bank accounts, his credit cards, and his cell phone records. After the night he vanished, his phone never pinged another cell tower. His credit cards were never swiped. His bank accounts remained completely untouched. He had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The disappearance of Brian Schaffer became a national obsession. It is the ultimate locked room mystery playing out in real life. People analyzed the footage frame by frame, suggesting wild theories. Some believe that Brian, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his mother and the pressure of medical school, had meticulously planned his own disappearance, finding an unseen blind spot in the camera system to escape and start a new life. But his family entirely rejected this. Brian loved Alexis. He was about to propose. He loved his father and his brother. He would never inflict that kind of agonizing pain on them, especially so soon after his mother's death. Others believed he met with foul play inside the bar. They suggested that an altercation occurred in the back rooms, and his body was somehow smuggled out in a trash bin or hidden within the walls of the construction site before the concrete was poured. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete pillars of the new construction, desperate to find an anomaly that might be a human body. The radar found nothing. The ugly tuna saloon eventually closed its doors permanently, but the mystery of what happened inside that building continues to haunt anyone who hears it. This story forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about our lives. We spend all our time building foundations. We go to school, we plan vacations, we buy rings for the people we love, and we operate under the absolute assumption that tomorrow is a guaranteed event. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid. But life is an incredibly fragile, unpredictable current. The physical world can shift in ways we cannot comprehend. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the sincerity of our connections. We never truly know when the last time we speak to someone will be. We never know when a simple goodbye will become a permanent silence. The grief that Brian's family endured, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a door to open that remained shut forever, is a stark reminder to hold the people we care about close. It is a reminder to live with patience, to express our love sincerely, and to never let a disagreement linger into the night, because the universe does not owe us closure. It does not owe us an explanation. Sometimes, the people we love the most simply step out of the frame, and we are left staring at an empty room for the rest of our lives. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive, isolated mountain range where a young boy vanished into thin air, only to be found days later miles away, telling a story about a creature that defies every law of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is an unspoken agreement we all silently accept when we walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital. We believe that no matter how chaotic, dangerous, or unpredictable the outside world gets, the emergency room is a sanctuary. It is a fortress built entirely on science, reason, and sterile protocols. If you are bleeding, they have the tools to stop it. If your heart stops beating, they have the technology and the training to restart it. The doctors and nurses in those brightly lit corridors are our protectors. They stand between us and the absolute worst moments of our lives. But what happens when the threat does not come from a bullet wound, a car crash, or a known infection? What happens when the patient you are desperately trying to save suddenly becomes a lethal, impossible biohazard, capable of taking down an entire room of highly trained medical professionals in a matter of seconds? Before we get into this terrifying true medical anomaly, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Riverside, California, in the early months of 1994, was a typical, bustling, suburban hub. The weather in February is usually mild, carrying a slight chill in the evening air that forces people to pull their jackets a little tighter. On the evening of Sunday, February 19th, 1994, the atmosphere inside the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital was steady. It was the kind of busy that seasoned medical staff are completely comfortable with. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant quiet tune. The smell of antiseptic floor cleaner hung heavily in the air. Among the staff on duty that night were people who had dedicated their lives to pulling strangers back from the brink of death. There was an attending physician named Dr. Humberto Ochoa, a man who had seen nearly every trauma imaginable. There was a registered nurse named Susan Kane, known for her steady hands and calm demeanor under intense pressure. And there was a senior medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, a brilliant young doctor who was deeply passionate about emergency medicine. They were a well-oiled machine. They were trained to handle absolute panic with clinical detachment. They were not, however, trained to handle the impossible. Just a few miles away from the bright lights of the hospital, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was living through a nightmare. Gloria was a mother, known to her friends and family as a kind and deeply loving person. But life had recently dealt her an incredibly cruel hand. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. The illness had ravaged her body, bringing with it an immense, unrelenting physical pain that shadowed her every waking moment. Despite the treatments and the brave face she put on for her children, her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Earlier that Sunday evening, Gloria began to experience severe distress. She was sitting in her home when a sudden wave of nausea and shortness of breath overtook her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She became deeply confused, her sentences slurring together as she tried to communicate with her terrified family. Realizing that something was catastrophically wrong, they rushed to the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly. They found Gloria in a state of severe cardiovascular distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed. They immediately loaded her into the back of the ambulance, strapped an oxygen mask over her face to flood her starving lungs with pure oxygen, and began the frantic drive to Riverside General Hospital. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors of the emergency bay burst open. The paramedics rushed the gurney down the hallway, shouting out Gloria's plunging vital signs. The medical team was waiting for them. They immediately directed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, a small enclosed space packed with life-saving equipment. The team swarmed the bed. Dr. Ochoa took command, barking out rapid-fire orders. They needed to stabilize her, and they needed to do it immediately. They quickly injected her with fast-acting sedatives and cardiac drugs designed to slow down a heart that was beating so fast it was failing to pump blood. They pushed Valium and Ativan into her veins. Nothing worked. Her heart rate continued to climb, vibrating in her chest rather than beating. Her lungs were failing. Realizing that she was on the absolute edge of a total collapse, Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to prepare the defibrillator. They needed to deliver a massive electric shock to her chest to reset her heart rhythm. As the nurses moved in to remove Gloria's shirt and place the adhesive defibrillator pads on her chest, a strange, collective pause settled over Trauma Room 1. The medical staff noticed something bizarre. Gloria's skin was covered in an unusual, thick, oily sheen. It did not look like the cold sweat of a dying patient. It looked like a thin layer of grease shining under the harsh overhead lights. At the exact same moment, an incredibly potent and bizarre odor began to fill the small room. It was a sharp, pungent, deeply chemical smell. Some of the nurses later described it as smelling like heavy garlic. Others said it smelled like a mix of ammonia and rotting fruit. It was a smell that made the back of the throat burn. It was a smell that simply did not belong in a sterile, carefully controlled hospital environment. But a patient was slipping away on the table. They could not stop to investigate a strange odor. They had to keep moving. Dr. Ochoa gave the order to draw blood. They needed immediate lab results to figure out what was destroying her organs. Nurse Susan Kane grabbed a fresh syringe, expertly found a vein in Gloria's arm, inserted the needle, and slowly pulled back the plunger. She watched as the dark red blood filled the plastic tube. Susan pulled the vial away, intending to hand it off to a technician. But as she looked at the tube, she froze. She held the vial up to the bright fluorescent lights. Floating inside the dark red liquid were tiny, solid, manila-colored particles. They looked like little crystals. Susan stared at it in complete disbelief. Blood does not crystallize inside the veins of a living human being. It was medically impossible. She leaned in slightly, bringing the vial closer to her face to inspect the bizarre phenomenon. As she did, she caught a direct whiff of the air escaping from the tiny hole at the top of the syringe. Instantly, Susan's face lost all its color. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a stainless steel medical cart. She gasped, telling her colleagues that her face was burning and that the room was violently spinning. Before anyone could reach out to catch her, Susan's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the linoleum floor, completely unconscious. The room erupted. One of the other nurses quickly grabbed Susan by the shoulders and dragged her out of Trauma Room 1, shouting for help. In the chaos, the vial of crystallized blood was handed to the senior resident, Julie Gorkinski. Julie took the warm plastic tube. She looked at the impossible manila crystals floating inside. She too leaned her head down to smell the syringe, trying to identify the chemical odor that was now suffocating the room. A wave of intense, crushing nausea hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt a massive weight pressed down on her chest. The bright lights of the trauma room smeared into blinding streaks. She knew she was about to pass out. She managed to hand the vial to another staff member and staggered out of the room, heading frantically toward the main nurse's station to sit down. She grabbed onto a wooden desk for support, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. Julie collapsed. When her colleagues rushed to her side, they were horrified to see that she was not just unconscious. She was actively seizing. Her body convulsed violently on the hospital floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed. Back inside Trauma Room 1, the nightmare was compounding. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was standing at the head of the bed, manually pumping a bag valve mask to force air into Gloria's failing lungs. Maureen felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her entire body. Her arms grew heavy. The beeping monitors faded into a distant echo. She let go of the mask, took 2 unsteady steps away from the bed, and collapsed face first onto the floor. Within a span of just a few minutes, 3 highly trained medical professionals had dropped to the ground, completely incapacitated by an invisible force radiating from the dying woman on the table. The emergency room descended into pure, unadulterated terror. The staff realized that whatever was killing Gloria Ramirez was now airborne, and it was taking them down one by one. The hospital administration was immediately notified. A code was called over the loudspeakers. The order was given to evacuate the entire emergency department. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. Dozens of patients, some sitting in wheelchairs with broken bones, some bleeding from lacerations, were rushed out of their rooms and wheeled outside into the cold night air of the hospital parking lot. The nurses and doctors set up a makeshift triage center under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. They worked frantically to keep their existing patients alive while simultaneously fleeing the invisible poison that had taken over their building. But inside Trauma Room 1, a small skeleton crew made the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice. Dr. Ochoa and a few brave nurses refused to abandon Gloria. They stayed inside the contaminated zone. They fought a losing battle against her failing heart. They charged the defibrillator and shocked her again and again. They pumped every resuscitation drug they had in the crash cart into her system. They worked in a room that felt like it was actively trying to kill them, taking shallow breaths, fighting through their own dizziness, burning eyes, and overwhelming nausea. Despite their heroic and terrifying efforts, the damage to Gloria's body was too severe. At 8:50 p.m., Dr. Ochoa stepped back from the bed, looked at the flat line on the monitor, and pronounced, "Gloria Ramirez, dead." The medical staff stepped away from her body, exhausted, traumatized, and terrified for their own lives. They carefully stripped off their scrubs, sealed them in hazardous waste bags, and thoroughly scrubbed themselves down in the emergency decontamination showers. The entire emergency room was sealed off behind thick plastic sheeting. The local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department, and eventually, a specialized hazardous materials team, dressed from head to toe in full containment suits. The hazmat team slowly entered the empty, silent hospital wing. They carried highly sensitive equipment designed to detect radiation, poisonous gas leaks, and chemical weapons. They slowly swept the hallways. They tested the air in Trauma Room 1. They tested the surfaces, the medical equipment, and the ventilation system. They found absolutely nothing. There were no toxic chemicals detected. The hospital was completely baffled. Over the next few days, the investigation widened. The county health department stepped in. When the coroner performed the autopsy on Gloria's body, the level of fear was so high that he and his team had to wear custom-made, fully enclosed aluminum protective suits with their own independent oxygen supplies. They performed the procedure inside a specially built, airtight containment chamber. They took tissue samples, blood samples, and tested her organs for every known toxin. Again, they found no evidence of known poisonous gases, no agricultural pesticides, and no radioactive materials. For a brief, insulting moment, the official ruling from the health department was mass hysteria. The officials suggested that the intense stress of working in the emergency room, combined with a strange but harmless smell, caused the staff to experience a localized psychological breakdown. They claimed the fainting was entirely in their heads. The medical staff was furious. You do not seize from a panic attack. More importantly, Julie Gorczynski, the resident who had handled the blood, spent 2 agonizing weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed severe internal complications. She developed a rare bone condition known as avascular necrosis, which literally caused the bone tissue in her knees to physically die and rot away due to a lack of blood supply. She required months of grueling physical therapy and multiple surgeries just to walk again. A psychological panic attack does not cause human bones to die. Something physical, something incredibly dangerous, had entered their bodies that night. Months later, a complex and terrifying chemical theory finally emerged. It was pieced together by a team of elite scientists at a national laboratory who spent weeks running computer simulations and chemical tests. The theory they proposed suggested a chain of events so unlikely it seemed like dark magic. Gloria was suffering from immense, unending pain due to her advanced cancer. It is highly believed that in her desperation for relief, she may have been using a common home remedy solvent called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, rubbing it directly onto her skin. This solvent is known to be a powerful pain reliever for muscles and joints. It also has a distinct garlic-like odor, and it leaves a thick, oily residue on the skin. This perfectly explained the strange smell and the sheen the nurses noticed when they removed her shirt. But DMSO by itself is not toxic. The deadly transformation happened because of the medical interventions. When the paramedics strapped the oxygen mask to Gloria's face in the ambulance, the intense saturation of pure oxygen in her blood reacted with the DMSO in her system. The oxygen molecules bonded with the solvent, creating a new chemical compound called dimethyl sulfone. Dimethyl sulfone is known to crystallize at room temperature. This perfectly explained the bizarre manila-colored particles Susan Kane saw floating in the blood tube when it hit the cool air of the emergency room. But even dimethyl sulfone is not a deadly poison. The final fatal catalyst happened in Trauma Room 1. When Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to use the defibrillator, the powerful electric shock delivered to Gloria's chest shot through her body and hit the newly formed chemical in her bloodstream. The intense electrical energy rearranged the molecules one last time. It converted the dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extraordinarily deadly, heavy, invisible poison gas. It is a blistering agent that destroys human tissue on contact. When Susan Kane drew the blood, that deadly gas bubbled out of the liquid. It entered the air of the small, poorly ventilated room, and it instantly poisoned the medical staff who inhaled it. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark and terrifying exploration of the unpredictable nature of our world. It speaks to the lengths a person will go to find relief from unbearable suffering, reaching for any remedy that might offer just a moment of peace. But more profoundly, it reveals how incredibly fragile the boundaries of our safety really are. We build massive fortresses of science and medicine. We believe we can control the variables of life and death with machines and protocols. Yet, a simple sequence of well-intentioned actions seeking comfort, applying oxygen to help someone breathe, trying to restart a failing heart, can accidentally summon a nightmare. It teaches us a grim lesson about the hidden consequences of our actions. It shows us that every choice we make carries unseen ripples, and sometimes the very things meant to save us are the exact things that seal our fate. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned town in the middle of the American Rust Belt, where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of urban explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We cover at least 3 of these stories every single week. So, if that is something you are into, please go ahead and gently sabotage the like button's internet connection right before it tries to join an important meeting. Tonight, we are heading out to the high desert of Nevada, a place where the horizon stretches for 100 miles in every direction, and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight on your chest. Most people who drive through this stretch of Highway 50, often called the loneliest road in America, are just trying to get from point A to point B as fast as their engine will allow. But for some, the desert is not just a place to pass through. It is a place where things that have been forgotten go to stay hidden. It was 2:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in middle of July, 2024. A man named Elias Thorne was driving his silver sedan toward the town of Ely. Elias was a long-haul surveyor, a man used to isolation, and he actually preferred the graveyard shift because the heat of the Nevada sun was enough to cook the brain of anyone foolish enough to work under it. The only thing keeping Elias company was the low hum of his tires against the cracked asphalt and the flickering glow of his dashboard. He reached over to his radio, hoping to find some classic rock or maybe a late-night talk show to keep his eyes open, but all he got was static. He twisted the dial slowly, listening to the white noise hiss through the speakers. Suddenly, the static cut out. It did not fade away. It simply vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute that Elias actually checked to see if his radio had lost power. But the small green light on the display was still glowing. The frequency read 99.7. Then, a voice came through. It was not the booming voice of a radio DJ or the frantic energy of an advertisement. It was a woman's voice. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of emotion. It sounded like she was reading a grocery list, but the words she was saying made the hair on the back of Elias's neck stand straight up. The voice said, "Sarah Miller, age 24, Reno. Departure scheduled for 4:12 a.m. tomorrow." Elias frowned, slowing his car down to 50 miles per hour. He thought it was some kind of weird indie radio play, or maybe a true crime podcast he had accidentally stumbled upon. He kept listening. The voice continued. "Marcus Higgins, age 52, Carson City. Departure scheduled for 5:30 a.m. tomorrow." The voice went on, listing names and cities, followed by specific times. Elias felt a cold chill wash over him, despite the desert heat still radiating from the ground. There was something so mechanical, so final, about the way the voice said the word departure. Elias arrived in Ely a few hours later, checked into a cheap motel, and tried to shake the feeling of that broadcast. But curiosity is a persistent thing. The next morning, he sat in a local diner and pulled up a news app on his phone. He searched for Reno. The headline at the top of the page hit him like a physical blow. A 24-year-old woman named Sarah Miller had been killed in a hit-and-run accident in downtown Reno. The time of death reported by the police was 4:12 a.m. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He scrolled down further. In Carson City, a man named Marcus Higgins had suffered a fatal heart attack while preparing for work, unquote. The emergency call had been placed by his wife at exactly 5:30 a.m. Elias sat there, his coffee going cold, staring at the screen. This was not a coincidence. This was something else. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on his survey maps. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Elias knew he had to go back out there. He had to know if the radio station was still broadcasting. He got back into his car at 11:15 p.m. and drove 20 miles out of town, back toward the empty stretch of highway where the signal had been strongest. He tuned the radio to 99.7. At first, there was only the desert wind. Then, at exactly midnight, the silence returned. The same woman's voice began to speak. Her tone had not changed. It was still that chilling, monotone cadence. Linda Graham, age 60, Elko. Departure scheduled for 3:18 a.m. Elias gripped the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. He wanted to turn the radio off, but he could not move his hand. He felt like he was eavesdropping on the inner workings of the universe. The voice continued for several minutes, listing names of people across the state of Nevada, and then the voice said a name that made Elias's heart stop. Elias Thorne, age 38, Highway 50. Departure scheduled for 4:22 a.m. Elias slammed on his brakes, his tires screaming as the car skidded to a halt in the middle of the dark road. He looked at his watch. It was 12:40 a.m. He had less than 4 hours. 1. The panic set in instantly. He began to breathe in short, jagged gasps. He looked around the dark desert, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows or a pair of headlights coming at him. But there was nothing. Just the sagebrush and the distant, jagged silhouettes of the mountains. His first instinct was to call for help. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. But it was not a dispatcher. It was the woman from the radio. Departure scheduled for 4:22 a.m., Elias, the voice said through the phone. Please ensure you are ready. Elias threw the phone onto the passenger seat as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He put the car in gear and floored it. He decided he was going to beat this. He was going to drive as far away from this stretch of road as possible. If the broadcast said he would depart on Highway 50, then he just had to get off Highway 50. He drove like a madman, pushing the sedan to 90 miles per hour. He watched the clock on the dashboard. 1:15 a.m., 2 o'clock a.m., 2:45 a.m. The road seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how fast he drove, he did not seem to be passing any landmarks. The mile markers remained the same, or perhaps he was just too panicked to read them correctly. At 3:30 a.m., his engine began to sputter. He looked at his fuel gauge. It was on full. He had filled up in Ely, but the car was losing power. It groaned and shuddered, the lights on the dashboard flickering wildly. No, 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 Elias whispered, pounding on the steering wheel. Not now. The car finally gave out and rolled to a stop. He was in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no houses, no other cars. Just the oppressive blackness of the Nevada night. He looked at his watch. 3:50 a.m. Elias got out of the car. He thought that if he stayed in the vehicle, he was a sitting duck. He started to run. He ran off the road, into the desert, tripping over rocks and tearing his clothes on the sharp desert scrub. He did not know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. At 4:10 a.m., he reached a small, crumbling shack. It looked like an old miner's cabin from the 1800s, half buried in the sand. He scrambled inside, huddling in the corner, his lungs burning. He stared at the glowing numbers on his watch. 4:15 a.m., 4:18 a.m. Somewhere in Elko, Linda Graham was departing. Elias closed his eyes and prayed. He thought about his life, about all the things he had put off, the people he had not called, the apologies he had never made. He realized that he had spent so much of his life just trying to get to the next place, never actually being present in the moment he was in. He had been so focused on his own isolation that he had forgotten how to truly live. 4:20 a.m. He heard a sound. It was faint at first, but it was growing louder. It was the sound of a radio. It was coming from inside the cabin. He looked over and saw an old, rusted transistor radio sitting on a wooden crate. It should not have been working. It had no batteries, and the wires were frayed and broken. But the green light was glowing. The woman's voice filled the small shack. "Elias Thorne," the voice said. "It is time." Elias looked at his watch. 4:22 a.m. He braced himself for a crash, for a heart attack, for a shadowy figure to emerge from the corner. But nothing happened. The world remained silent. Elias sat there for a long time, his eyes squeezed shut. Minutes passed. He slowly opened one eye, then the other. He looked at his watch. It was 4:30 a.m. He was still alive. He began to laugh, a hysterical sobbing sound that echoed off the wooden walls. He had made it. The radio was wrong. It was just a prank, or a glitch, or some bizarre psychological trick played by the desert heat. He stood up, brushing the dust off his jeans. He felt a profound sense of relief, a second chance at life. He walked out of the cabin, intending to find his way back to the road and wait for a passerby. But when he stepped outside, the desert was gone. There was no Highway 50. There were no mountains. There was no sky. Elias was standing on a vast, endless platform of white light. In every direction, as far as he could see, there were people, thousands of them. They were all walking in the same direction, moving toward a horizon that seemed to hum with a soft golden glow. He saw a woman walking near him. She looked to be about 60 years old, wearing a nightgown. She looked peaceful, almost relieved. "Linda?" Elias asked, his voice sounding thin and distant. The woman turned and smiled at him. "Hello, Elias," she said. "You're right on time." Elias looked back at the cabin, but it was gone too. Everything he had known, everything he had been running toward or away from, was gone. He realized then that the departure the radio spoke of wasn't about the moment of death. It was about the moment of leaving the world behind. The accidents, the heart attacks, the breakdowns, those were just the doors. He had spent his final hours in a state of pure terror, fighting against the inevitable, only to find that the destination was not something to be feared. He had been so worried about the time he had left that he hadn't noticed he had already stopped living long before he reached the desert. The radio wasn't a warning to save himself. It was an invitation to let go. Elias took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He looked at the golden light on the horizon, joined the crowd, and began to walk. The signal for 99.7 still broadcasts out there in the high desert, but only for those who are traveling alone in the deepest part of the night. If you find yourself on Highway 50 and the static suddenly turns to silence, you might want to keep your eyes on the road. Or perhaps you should just listen, because sometimes the most important things in life are the ones we only understand when they are over. But that is a story for another time. There is a profound and comforting illusion that we all rely on every single night before we go to sleep. We walk around our homes, we turn off the kitchen lights, we make sure the stove is off, and we turn the deadbolt on the front door. We listen to the heavy metal click of the lock, and in that sound, we find an absolute sense of security. We believe that four walls and a locked door are enough to keep the chaos of the outside world completely separate from our safe, private lives. We believe that if danger ever tries to cross our threshold, there will be a loud struggle, a broken window, or enough time to dial 911. But what happens when the very place you feel the most secure becomes the site of an impossible vanishing? What happens when three grown women disappear from a small suburban house in the middle of the night, leaving behind their money, their cars, their clothes, and absolutely no sign of a struggle, as if they simply dissolved into the warm summer air? Before we unlock the doors to one of the most chilling and perplexing unsolved mysteries in American history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Springfield, Missouri, in the early summer of 1992, was the quintessential picture of Midwestern peace. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, kids rode their bikes down tree-lined streets until the streetlights came on, and violent crime was something that happened in other, bigger cities. June 6th was a particularly joyous day in Springfield. It was graduation day for the local high school. The air was thick with the humidity of early summer and the infectious excitement of hundreds of teenagers stepping into the adult world. Among those graduates were two beautiful, vibrant young women named Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall. Susie was 19 years old, known for her outgoing personality and her striking blonde hair. Stacy was 18 years old, a sweet, deeply loved young woman who was eagerly preparing for her upcoming college years. The two girls had been friends for a long time, and they had spent weeks planning the perfect way to celebrate their graduation night. Their original plan was to leave Springfield right after the graduation ceremonies and drive down to Branson, Missouri, where they had booked a hotel room. They were going to spend the weekend swimming, exploring, and celebrating with a large group of their classmates. But as graduation day wore on, those plans slowly began to unravel. The hotel in Branson fell through due to a miscommunication, and the girls found themselves without a place to stay for their highly anticipated weekend getaway. Instead of letting the ruined plans ruin their night, Susie and Stacy decided to stay in Springfield and hop between the various graduation house parties happening across town. They spent the evening laughing, dancing, and saying their goodbyes to classmates they might never see again. Around 2 a.m., the parties began to die down. The girls were exhausted. Stacy was originally supposed to sleep over at a different friend named Janelle's house, but Janelle's house was incredibly crowded with other teenagers who had the same idea. Susie suggested that they just go back to her house on Delmar Street. It would be quiet, they could wash off their makeup, and they could sleep in late. Stacy agreed, and she called her mother to let her know about the change of plans. The house on Delmar Street belonged to Susie's mother, a 47-year-old woman named Cheryl Levitt. Cheryl was a beloved local hairdresser, an incredibly hardworking single mother who had dedicated her entire life to providing for Susie. Cheryl and Susie shared a very close, trusting relationship. They were more like best friends than a traditional mother and daughter. While the girls had been out partying, Cheryl had enjoyed a quiet, relaxing evening at home. She had spent the afternoon painting a wooden dresser in the garage. Around 11:15 p.m., she had called a friend to chat, sounding perfectly happy and normal. After getting off the phone, Cheryl presumably washed up, put on her floral nightgown, and climbed into her bed, reading a book while her small Yorkshire Terrier, Cinnamon, curled up at her feet. She left the front porch light on, waiting for her daughter to come home. At roughly 2:15 a.m., Susie and Stacy arrived at the house on Delmar Street in their separate vehicles. They parked their cars in the curved driveway, right next to Cheryl's car. They walked up the pathway, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. What happened inside that house between the hours of 2:15 a.m. and 8 a.m. is a black hole of information that has terrified investigators for decades. The next morning, Sunday, June 7th, the sun rose hot and bright over Springfield. Janelle, the friend whose house the girls had initially planned to sleep at, woke up early. She had promised to meet Susie and Stacy that morning so they could all go to a nearby water park to spend the day together. When the girls did not show up at the agreed-upon time, Janelle assumed they had just overslept. She got into her car and drove over to the house on Delmar Street. When Janelle pulled up to the house around 9 a.m., she noticed that Susie's, Stacy's, and Cheryl's cars were all parked in the driveway. This made sense. They were home. They were just sleeping. Janelle walked up the short concrete path leading to the front door. As she stepped onto the front porch, she noticed something slightly odd. The glass globe that covered the front porch light was completely shattered. Small shards of jagged glass were scattered across the concrete welcome mat. Janelle carefully stepped over the glass and reached for the front door handle. She expected it to be locked, but when she turned the brass knob, it clicked open effortlessly. The front door was completely unlocked. Janelle pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. She called out for Susie and Stacy, her voice echoing in the quiet house. There was no answer. The only sound was the frantic, high-pitched barking of Cheryl's dog, Cinnamon. The little dog was running around the living room in a state of absolute distress. Cinnamon was usually a very calm dog, but this morning she was highly agitated, pacing back and forth and whining near the front door. Janelle walked further into the house. The television in the living room was turned on, emitting a quiet hum, but displaying only static snow. She walked into Susie's bedroom. The bed looked as though it had been slept in, but the room was empty. She walked into Cheryl's bedroom. Again, the bed covers were pulled back, but Cheryl was nowhere to be found. Janelle went into the bathroom. Sitting neatly on the bathroom counter were 2 wet washcloths, carefully folded over the edge of the sink. Beside them were Susie and Stacy's makeup remover pads. This indicated that the girls had indeed made it home safely, gone through their entire nighttime routine, and prepared for bed. Starting to feel a genuine sense of unease, Janelle went back into the living room. Sitting perfectly undisturbed on the coffee table were 3 purses. They belonged to Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy. Janelle looked inside them. Stacy's wallet still contained a large amount of cash from her graduation gifts. Cheryl's purse held her keys, her money, and a pack of cigarettes she never left the house without. Women do not leave their homes without their purses. They certainly do not leave without their money, their keys, and their cars. Confused and frightened, Janelle called Stacy's mother, Janice McCall. Janice had been waiting for her daughter to come home all morning. When Janelle explained that the girls were not at the house, but all their belongings were there, Janice immediately felt a cold spike of dread in her chest. She told Janelle to stay put, and she and her husband immediately drove to the house on Delmar Street. When Stacy's parents arrived, they searched the house frantically. They looked in the closets, the garage, and the backyard. There was absolutely no sign of the 3 women. The house was perfectly clean. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle whatsoever. It looked exactly like a home where the occupants had just stepped into the other room for a moment. In their panic, Stacy's parents made a decision that they would deeply regret for the rest of their lives. Hoping to find a clue as to where the girls might have gone, they began cleaning up the shattered glass from the front porch. They carefully swept the shards into a dustpan and threw them into the garbage, completely unaware that they were destroying the only physical piece of evidence left at a major crime scene. While they were waiting for the police to arrive, the telephone in the kitchen rang. Janelle answered it. The voice on the other end of the line was a man. He began speaking in a deeply disturbing, sexually explicit manner. The things he was saying were so horrible that Janelle immediately slammed the phone down in shock. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Janelle answered it, and it was the same man saying the same terrifying things. She hung up again. When the police finally arrived on the scene, they walked into a house that was now filled with panicked family members and friends. The crime scene, if it was one, had been completely compromised, by people walking through the rooms, touching surfaces, and sweeping the porch. The detectives began their investigation by examining the answering machine in Cheryl's bedroom. The machine indicated that there was one new, unheard message. An officer pressed the play button. The tape whirred, and a message began to play. It was a very strange, cryptic message, but just as the investigators leaned in to listen closely, the officer's finger slipped. He accidentally hit the delete button instead of the save button. The tape completely erased. The message, and whatever crucial clue it might have held, was gone forever in a fraction of a second. Despite the blunders, the police realized they were dealing with a massive, unprecedented situation. 3 adult women do not voluntarily vanish from a locked house without taking a single personal item. The local authorities called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The quiet street was quickly swarmed with federal agents, crime scene technicians, and tracking dogs. The technicians dusted the entire house for fingerprints. They found nothing out of the ordinary. They sprayed the carpets and walls with luminol, a chemical that illuminates microscopic traces of blood that have been cleaned up. The house glowed completely dark. There was not a single drop of blood anywhere. The tracking dogs were given the women's clothing to pick up their scent. The dogs led the handlers out the front door, down the driveway, and into the street. But as soon as the dogs reached the pavement, the scent abruptly stopped. It did not fade away into the woods. It did not trail down the block. It stopped immediately, exactly where a vehicle would have been parked. This led investigators to a chilling, undeniable conclusion. Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy did not walk away from that house. They were placed into a vehicle and driven away. But how does someone kidnap 3 healthy, capable adults from a small house in a quiet neighborhood without making a sound? Cheryl was a fiercely protective mother. If someone had broken down the door and threatened her daughter, she would have fought to the death. The neighbors, whose houses were only feet away, reported hearing absolutely nothing that night. No screams, no barking dogs, no breaking glass. The detectives realized that the shattered porch light was the key to understanding the nightmare. It was not broken during a struggle. The glass was shattered before the women ever opened the door. The terrifying theory constructed by the FBI suggests that a predator, or perhaps a group of predators, had been watching the house on Delmar Street. They saw Cheryl go to sleep. They unscrewed or broke the porch-like globe to plunge the front entryway into absolute darkness. And then they waited. When Susie and Stacy arrived at 2:15 a.m., they walked up the dark path. They unlocked the door. They stepped inside, washed their faces, and got ready for bed. The prevailing theory is that the attacker was already inside the house, hiding in the dark, or that they knocked on the door shortly after the girls arrived, holding a weapon, and forced their way inside. To control 3 adults without a struggle, the attacker would have needed an overwhelming threat. They would have needed a firearm, and they would have needed the element of total surprise. The attacker woke Cheryl up, gathered the 3 terrified women in the living room, and quietly ordered them out the front door, threatening to shoot them if they made a single sound. They were marched out into the warm summer night, loaded into a waiting vehicle, and driven off into the dark, leaving their entire lives behind on the coffee table. Years passed. The case of the Springfield 3 became one of the most heavily investigated missing persons cases in the country. The police received over 5,000 tips. They excavated concrete foundations of new parking garages looking for bodies. They drained local lakes. They interviewed known criminals who were active in the area at the time. A few men came forward with vague confessions, hoping to get lighter sentences for other crimes, but their stories were always full of inconsistencies and led to dead ends. To this day, over 30 years later, not a single trace of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, or Stacy McCall has ever been found. No clothing, no jewelry, no bones. The house on Delmar Street still stands, a quiet, suburban monument to an impossible tragedy. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound and terrifying exploration of how incredibly fragile our sense of safety truly is. We build our homes, we buy our locks, and we go to sleep believing that we are the masters of our domain. But the truth is, the walls we build can only protect us from the things we can see coming. It teaches us a grim, vital lesson about the fleeting nature of our reality. The graduation parties, the laughter, the mundane act of taking off makeup, all of it was erased in a matter of minutes by an unseen darkness. It reminds us that we must hold on to the moments we have with the people we love with absolute sincerity. We must appreciate the quiet evenings, the mundane conversations, and the simple comfort of knowing our family is sleeping in the next room, because life is completely unpredictable, and the universe does not guarantee us a tomorrow. Sometimes, despite our best efforts and our locked doors, the outside world reaches in and takes everything, leaving nothing behind but questions that will never, ever be answered. If you found this story fascinating, you're going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive ancient hotel in the middle of a bustling city and a series of security tapes that show a young woman playing a terrifying game of hide and seek with something no one else can see. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a specific kind of terror that belongs only to the deep woods in the dead of winter. It is a quiet, suffocating kind of fear. When the sun drops behind the trees and the temperature plummets, the landscape changes from a peaceful escape into a merciless trap. If you make a mistake out there, the elements do not care about your intentions. They do not care if you are a good person. They only demand that you survive. But what happens when 5 young men, who have no business being in the mountains, abandon a perfectly working vehicle in the middle of a snowy road and willingly walk into the pitch-black, freezing wilderness? Before we dive into that, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was Friday, February 24th, 1978. In the quiet, close-knit communities of Yuba City and Marysville, California, 5 young men were buzzing with excitement. They were Ted Viher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias. Ranging in age from 24 to 32, these men were inseparable friends. They all lived at home with their parents, and they all shared a profound, innocent love for the game of basketball. They played on a local team called the Gateway Gators, a team sponsored by a local vocational program. The very next day, Saturday, they were scheduled to play their first game in a week-long tournament. The winner of the tournament would get a free week in Los Angeles, a prize that felt like an absolute dream to these 5 men. They had laid out their uniforms on their beds. They had asked their parents to wake them up early. They were ready. But on that Friday night, they wanted to watch a college basketball game. UC Davis was playing against Chico State. Jack Madruga owned a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, a car he treated like his most prized possession. He would never let anyone else drive it, and he kept it in pristine condition. Around evening time, the 5 friends piled into Jack's car and drove south from Yuba City to Davis, California, a drive of about 50 miles. The game was everything they hoped for. It was loud, thrilling, and full of energy. When the final buzzer sounded around 10 p.m., the group left the gymnasium and got back into the Mercury Montego. They drove a short distance to a local convenience store in downtown Chico. The clerk working that night remembered them clearly. They were loud, happy, and polite. They bought some Hostess cherry pies, lemon pies, chocolate bars, and a few cartons of soda. The receipt showed it was slightly after 10:30 p.m. They got back into the car. All they had to do was drive straight south, down the familiar highway, back to their warm beds in Yuba City, to rest for their big game the next morning. But they never made it home. When Saturday morning arrived, the parents of the 5 men woke up to find their sons' empty beds. The uniforms they had laid out the night before were untouched. Panic set in immediately. These were not men who stayed out all night, drinking or partying. Some of them had mild intellectual conditions, and Gary Mathias managed a treatable psychiatric condition. They relied heavily on the structure of their homes and the comfort of their families. For all 5 of them to vanish without a word was completely out of character. The families started calling each other, realizing that none of the boys had returned. They immediately contacted the local authorities. If this were happening today, someone might have dialed 911 the moment they felt something was wrong. But back then, they frantically dialed the local police station to report them missing. The police initiated a search, retracing the route from Davis back to Yuba City. They checked the highways, the ditches, and the local hospitals. They found absolutely nothing. Days ticked by. Sunday passed. Monday passed. The community was paralyzed with worry. Then, on Tuesday, February 28th, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the mystery. A forest ranger was driving up a remote, treacherous dirt road in the Plumas National Forest. This road was roughly 70 miles away from Chico, and it was in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It went high up into the mountains, far away from any major highway or town. The road was unpaved, deeply rutted, and covered in snow. As the ranger navigated a steep, winding curve, he spotted a turquoise and white Mercury Montego abandoned on the side of the road. It was Jack Madruga's car. The police rushed to the scene, expecting the worst. But when they examined the vehicle, the situation made absolutely no sense. The car was sitting in a few inches of snow, slightly off the main ruts of the road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of a struggle. The gas tank was a quarter full. When a mechanic eventually checked the engine, he found that the car started up immediately. It ran perfectly. Even stranger, the tires were not stuck. 5 grown men could have easily pushed the car back onto the firm gravel with a few minutes of effort. Inside the car, police found the wrappers from the snacks the boys had bought at the convenience store. They found neatly folded maps in the glove compartment. The keys were missing, which suggested Jack had locked up his beloved car. But one of the windows was rolled down, letting the freezing winter air blow into the cabin. The most terrifying realization for the police was the location. The Plumas National Forest in February is an unforgiving place. The elevation is high, and the temperatures at night drop well below freezing. The 5 men were not dressed for the mountains. They were wearing light jackets, sneakers, and casual clothes. Why would they drive 70 miles out of their way, up a terrifying pitch-black mountain road, only to abandon a perfectly functioning car that could have served as a warm shelter? Why did they walk into the dark, freezing woods instead of simply turning the car around or sleeping inside until morning? The search and rescue teams scoured the woods surrounding the car. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and men on horseback. But a severe winter storm moved into the mountains shortly after the car was found, dumping several feet of fresh snow over the entire area. The dogs lost the scent. The helicopters could not see through the dense canopy of trees and the blinding snow. The search had to be called off. The families were left in an agonizing limbo, wondering if their sons were freezing somewhere in the dark, calling out for help that would never come. As the investigation continued, a man named Joseph Shawns came forward with a story that sent chills down the spines of the detectives. Joseph told police that on the exact night the boys went missing, he had driven up that same mountain road to check on a cabin he owned. Around 5:30 p.m., his car had gotten deeply stuck in the snow just a short distance past where Jack's Mercury Montego was eventually found. Joseph tried to push his car out, but while doing so, he experienced severe chest pains. Believing he was having a heart attack, he crawled back into his car, turned on the heater, and lay there in agony, hoping someone would drive by. Hours passed. It was incredibly dark and eerily quiet. Then, around 11:30 p.m., Joseph saw headlights coming up the road behind him. He looked out his window and saw a car park roughly 50 yards away. It was a turquoise and white car. He saw a group of people get out. They were standing around the car, talking. Desperate for help, Joseph opened his door and called out to them. He yelled that he was having a heart attack and needed assistance. What happened next makes the blood run cold. The moment Joseph called out, the voices completely stopped. The people standing around the car instantly went silent. A moment later, the headlights of the turquoise car were turned off. The silence of the mountain returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Joseph lay there in the dark, terrified and confused. Why would they ignore a man pleading for help? Why would they turn off their lights and hide? A few hours later, Joseph claimed he saw flashlights moving in the trees, and he called out again. Once again, the flashlights immediately clicked off, and the woods went dead silent. Eventually, Joseph's car ran out of gas. By some miracle, he survived the night and managed to walk 8 miles down the mountain the next morning, until he found a lodge where someone helped him. He never saw the boys again. If Joseph's story was true, it implied that the 5 men were terrified of something. They were hiding. But hiding from what? Or who? Months went by. The brutal winter slowly gave way to spring, and the thick layers of snow in the Plumas National Forest finally began to melt. In early June, a group of motorcyclists were riding on a remote trail deep in the mountains, about 19 miles uphill from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came across an old, heavily weathered Forest Service trailer. It was a shelter used by rangers during the summer months. As the motorcyclists approached, they noticed a pungent, unmistakable smell radiating from the trailer. One of the front windows had been broken. A motorcyclist stepped up, peered through the shattered glass, and immediately backed away in horror. Inside the trailer was a bed. On the bed lay a body wrapped tightly from head to toe in 8 heavy blankets. Police were called to the scene. When they unwrapped the blankets, they identified the body as Ted Wire. The scene inside the trailer was one of the most baffling and heartbreaking things the seasoned detectives had ever witnessed. Ted had not died of unnatural trauma. He had starved to death, and he was suffering from severe frostbite. His feet were badly damaged by the cold. Judging by the growth of his beard and his drastic weight loss, the coroner determined that Ted had lived inside that trailer for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks before finally passing away. He had suffered in that freezing, dark box for months. But the tragedy of his death was overshadowed by the baffling environment around him. The trailer was stocked with survival supplies. There were heavy winter coats, boots, and warm clothing folded neatly on shelves. None of them had been worn. There was a propane tank outside, connected to a heater inside the trailer. All Ted had to do was turn a valve to have a heated room. The valve was never turned. Most disturbing of all, there was a storage locker inside the trailer that contained enough freeze-dried food and military rations to keep all 5 men alive and fully fed for a year. The locker was sitting right next to the bed where Ted died. A few cans of food had been opened and consumed, apparently using an Army surplus can opener that belonged to Gary Mathias. But the vast majority of the food was completely untouched. Ted had literally starved to death while sleeping next to a mountain of food, and frozen to death while surrounded by fuel, fire starters, and heavy coats. Why didn't he eat? Why didn't he turn on the heat? The strange clues did not stop there. Sitting neatly on a table inside the trailer were Ted's leather shoes, his wallet with cash still inside, a gold ring, and a gold necklace. And near the door, investigators found a pair of sneakers. They belonged to Gary Mathias. This meant Gary had been inside the trailer with Ted. He had taken off his sneakers and, presumably, put on a pair of heavy boots from the trailer's supply before leaving. But where did he go? Why did he leave his friend behind? The search teams intensified their efforts in the woods surrounding the trailer. What they found only added to the nightmare. The remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found roughly halfway between the abandoned car and the trailer. They were located on opposite sides of the logging road. Based on the condition of their remains, investigators deduced that they had succumbed to the freezing temperatures on the very first night. They had literally frozen to death while trying to walk the 19 miles up the mountain. A few days later, a searcher found a skull and some clothing scattered near a thicket of bushes not far from the trailer. Dental records confirmed it was Jack Hewitt. But Gary Mathias was never found. His sneakers inside the trailer were the last trace he ever left on this earth. Extensive searches covering miles of dense forest yielded absolutely nothing. No clothing, no bones, no clues. He had simply vanished into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The investigation slowly ground to a halt. There was no evidence of foul play, no sign of an attacker, and no logical explanation for anything that had happened. The authorities theorized that the men had somehow taken a wrong turn in Chico, gotten lost, and ended up on the mountain road. Perhaps they hit a snowbank, panicked in the dark, and believed the car was permanently stuck. When they saw Joseph Shawns calling for help, perhaps they thought he was a threat, or they were simply too frightened by the strange situation to respond. They abandoned the safety of their car and started walking. But why walk uphill? Why walk deeper into the freezing forest instead of downhill toward the safety of the valley? The prevailing theory is that they saw the distant lights of a Forest Service cabin, or thought they were on a different road altogether. As they trudged through the deep snow in their light clothing, the brutal cold began to take its toll. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling fell behind and quietly passed away in the snow. The remaining three, Gary, Ted, and Jack Hewitt, managed to reach the Forest Service trailer 19 miles away. Once inside, they broke a window to get in. In the pitch-black darkness, terrified and freezing, their logic completely broke down. They did not realize how much food was in the locker. They were too scared to touch the propane valve, perhaps fearing an explosion. Ted's feet were so badly frostbitten that he could not walk. Gary and Jack Hewitt stayed with him for a while, opening a few cans of food to keep him alive. But eventually, as weeks dragged on and Ted grew weaker, Gary and Jack Hewitt realized they had to go get help. They left the trailer. Jack Hewitt did not make it far before the elements claimed his life. Gary Mathias took a different path, perhaps trying to find a road or a town, and walked deep into the unknown until he, too, was swallowed by the forest. Ted, unable to move, waited in the dark trailer for his friends to return. He waited for weeks. He waited until his body simply could not endure any more pain, and he quietly passed away, entirely alone. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark reminder of the fragile line between safety and disaster. It shows how a single, unexplainable decision, taking a wrong turn on a dark night, can lead to irreversible consequences. The universe does not offer second chances to those who wander into its harshest domains. It is completely indifferent to our innocence, our hopes, and our fears. For the families of the 5 men, the pain of not knowing the exact truth was a burden they carried for the rest of their lives. They had to live with the agonizing reality that their sons suffered in the cold, calling out for families who could not hear them. It teaches us a grim lesson about the limits of our control. We can plan our lives, lay out our clothes for tomorrow, and dream about the future. But sometimes, despite our best intentions and our purest hearts, the dark unknown reaches out and pulls us away, leaving nothing behind but questions that will never be answered. The American Dyatlov Pass remains one of the most baffling and heartbreaking mysteries in modern history. The woods up in the Plumas National Forest still hold their secrets, buried under decades of snow and silence. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a seemingly normal house in a quiet neighborhood and a hidden room that contained a secret so dark the police officers who found it immediately requested counseling. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. Imagine being entirely engulfed in absolute suffocating darkness. You cannot move your arms. You cannot move your legs. The air you breathe is thick with the taste of ancient dust and damp clay. Every time you exhale, the solid stone walls surrounding you seem to shift, squeezing your chest just a fraction tighter. The blood rushes to your head, your heart pounds frantically against your ribs, and the only sound you can hear is your own ragged, panicked breathing, echoing in a space no larger than a washing machine. This is not a terrifying nightmare you can wake up from. For one man, this was the chilling reality of a family holiday gone horribly, unimaginably wrong. If you find yourself drawn to true stories that explore the strange, dark, and mysterious corners of our world, you have come to the right place. We tell stories just like this one, focusing on the deeply unsettling and the bizarre. Before we dive into the pitch-black depths of today's narrative, please sneak into the like button's house, locate their favorite bottle of shampoo, replace the contents entirely with superglue, and then calmly walk out the front door. The year was 2009. It was the week of Thanksgiving, a time usually reserved for warmth, family dinners, and gratitude. John Edward Jones, a 26-year-old medical student, had traveled back to his home state of Utah with his wife and their young daughter. They were expecting their second child soon, and life for John was full of promise. He was known among his friends and family as a warm, devout, and deeply caring individual. He was tall, athletic, and in his youth, he had been an avid caver. He and his brother Josh used to spend their weekends exploring the various cave systems scattered across Utah, navigating the dark subterranean worlds with the fearless energy of youth. But as John grew older, went to college, got married, and entered medical school, those caving adventures had faded into fond memories. He had not been in a cave for years. However, with the family gathered for the holiday and a few days of free time stretching out before them, a wave of nostalgia hit the brothers. They decided to organize a small expedition with some friends and family members to visit a place they had heard of but never fully conquered. It was a local favorite, known as Nutty Putty Cave. Nutty Putty Cave was not your typical grand cavern filled with massive stalactites and underground lakes. Discovered in 1960, it was a hydrothermal cave, meaning it was formed by superheated water cutting through the limestone from below. This process left behind a sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of narrow tubes, tight squeezes, and sharp drops. The walls of Nutty Putty were coated in a viscous, clay-like mud that felt sticky and slippery all at once, which is exactly how the cave earned its peculiar name. Because of its narrow passages, the cave was infamous among the local spelunking community. It demanded visitors to crawl on their bellies, contort their bodies, and squeeze through terrifyingly tight spaces. At around 8 p.m. on the evening of November 24th, the group arrived at the desolate, rocky hill that marked the entrance of the cave. The weather above ground was freezing, a harsh winter chill biting at their faces, but as they descended into the mouth of Nutty Putty, the temperature rose significantly. The earth insulated the cave, keeping it at a humid, stagnant 70 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. They switched on their headlamps, the beams of light cutting through the absolute darkness, and began their descent. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The group navigated through the initial, wider sections of the cave. They slid down a slick, muddy incline known as the Big Slide, laughing and chatting, enjoying the thrill of the underground exploration. John and Josh, feeling confident, decided they wanted to push further into the more challenging depths of the system. They split from the main group, aiming for a notorious section of the cave known as the Birth Canal. The Birth Canal was a famously tight tunnel that forced cavers to squeeze through a space barely wide enough for a human torso, before suddenly opening up into a spacious, comfortable cavern where they could stand up and rest. John took the lead. He crawled on his stomach through the winding muddy tubes, his headlamp sweeping across the identical-looking walls of gray and brown rock. Without realizing it, in the confusing and unmapped lower sections of the cave, John took a wrong turn. He had bypassed the actual birth canal entirely and was now dragging himself into a highly dangerous, unmapped fissure known only to a few hardcore cavers. As Ed's push, the tunnel began to slope downward at a severe angle. The ceiling lowered, and the walls pressed in closer to his shoulders. John, assuming this was the famous birth canal he had heard about, believed that if he just pushed a little further, he would pop out into the large room on the other side. So, he kept going. He wriggled forward like a worm, using his elbows and toes to inch his way down the increasingly steep incline. Soon, the tunnel became so narrow that he could no longer use his arms to pull himself forward. His arms were pinned against his sides, and one arm was forced backward above his head. The tunnel then took a sharp, nearly 90-degree downward drop. John, fighting against gravity and the slick mud, slid forward headfirst into the vertical crevice. Suddenly, his chest became wedged against the unyielding stone. He was stuck. He was nearly upside down, trapped at an agonizing 70-degree angle. The space was barely 10 inches wide and 18 inches high. To put that into perspective, it is the size of the opening of a standard front-loading washing machine, but made of jagged, immovable rock. John exhaled, trying to make his chest smaller to slip through, but as he let the air out of his lungs, his body slid an inch deeper into the narrow V-shaped wedge of the crevice. When he instinctively tried to inhale again, his chest could not expand. The rock walls were pressing directly against his ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, immediately set in. He tried to wiggle backward, but his body was completely corked in the hole. Every slight movement only caused him to sink deeper due to the slick clay and the steep downward angle. He called out for his brother. Josh, who was a few yards behind him in the tunnel, heard the muffled, panicked cries. He crawled forward until he saw John's boots protruding from the tiny hole in the floor of the tunnel. Josh reached down, grabbed his brother's calves, and pulled with all his might. For a brief second, John slid upward, but the space was so cramped that Josh could not get a proper grip. When Josh's hands slipped, John immediately slid back down into the crevice, wedging himself even deeper than before. The sheer force of the drop slammed John's chest into the rock, knocking the wind out of him in a terrifying gasp. Through the narrow gap, John managed to speak. His voice was strained, thick with terror. He told Josh that he could not breathe, that he was trapped, and that he needed help. Josh, realizing the horrifying reality of the situation, knew he could not pull John out alone. He told his brother to stay calm, prayed with him for a brief moment, and then scrambled backward through the twisting, claustrophobic tunnels to reach the surface. Once outside, breathing the freezing night air, Josh called 911. It was now roughly 9:30 p.m. The response was massive. Within an hour, the desolate dirt road leading to the cave was lit up by the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers, fire trucks, and search and rescue vehicles. Over 130 rescue workers, including the most experienced volunteer cavers in the region, descended upon the site. They set up a command center, brought in massive floodlights, and began organizing a rescue operation. The first rescuer to reach John was a woman named Susie. She was small, agile, and an expert in navigating tight subterranean spaces. It took her over an hour of agonizing crawling through the muddy labyrinth just to reach the spot where Josh had left his brother. When she finally arrived, all she could see were the soles of John's climbing boots sticking out from the jagged hole. She called out to him. John's voice came back, weak, muffled, and laced with exhaustion. He asked her if she was there to get him out. He told her he really wanted to get out. Susie assessed the situation, and the reality she reported back to the surface was grim. John was wedged in the worst possible position imaginable. Because he was completely upside down, His body was fighting a losing battle against gravity. The human circulatory system is not designed to function upside down for extended periods. Gravity was pulling all of his blood down into his brain and his lungs. His heart was being forced to pump twice as hard to push the blood back up to his legs. Fluid was already beginning to build up in his lungs, a condition known as pulmonary edema, making every single breath a monumental struggle. Furthermore, the space was simply too small for any specialized rescue equipment. They could not use jackhammers or explosives to widen the tunnel because the vibrations would likely cause a cave-in, crushing John instantly. The rock surrounding him was solid limestone, too hard to chip away by hand in such a cramped position. The only option was to pull him out by his feet. For the next 12 hours, the rescue effort was a grueling, heart-wrenching test of endurance. Rescuers worked in shifts, crawling down into the claustrophobic nightmare, staying with John, giving him sips of water through a long tube, and trying to keep him awake and calm. They lowered a two-way radio down to him so he could speak with his wife, who was waiting in absolute agony on the surface. Her voice, echoing through the dark, cold stone, was the only thing keeping John tethered to the world above. The rescue team eventually devised a plan. They would drill heavy-duty climbing anchors into the walls of the tunnel above John, thread a specialized rope through the anchors to create a complex pulley system, tie the rope around John's legs, and have a team of men pull in unison. It was a brutal, physically demanding strategy, but it was their only hope. By late afternoon of November 25th, nearly 20 hours into the ordeal, the pulley system was finally rigged. The air in the cave was thick with sweat, clay dust, and desperate hope. The command was given to pull. 8 strong men, wedged awkwardly in the tunnel above, hauled back on the rope. Slowly, agonizingly, John's body began to move upward. The friction against the rock ripped his clothes and scraped his skin, and John screamed in severe pain. Because the tunnel had a bend in it, as they pulled him up by his feet, his legs were being forced against the low ceiling of the tunnel above him. The angle was breaking his body, but it was working. They managed to pull him up several feet. For the first time in almost a day, John was able to make eye contact with one of his rescuers. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from the pooling blood, his face covered in mud, but he was out of the tightest part of the crevice. They gave him a brief moment to rest before the final pull that would clear him of the drop entirely. And then, the unthinkable happened. As the men held the tension on the rope, a sudden, violently loud crack echoed through the cavern. The stone archway, where the main climbing anchor had been drilled, was not as solid as they had believed. The rock shattered under the immense pressure. A massive piece of stone broke away, sending a heavy metal carabiner flying through the narrow tunnel like a bullet, striking one of the rescuers in the face and momentarily knocking him unconscious. Without the anchor holding the tension, the rope went completely slack. Instantly, gravity reclaimed its victim. John plummeted backward, sliding headfirst all the way down the steep, slick rock face, dropping entirely back into the exact same impossibly tight wedge where he had started. The impact wedged him even deeper, tighter, and lower than before. The dust settled. The rescuers, battered and shocked in the dim light of their headlamps, scrambled to reorient themselves. They called down into the hole. There was no answer. The drop had forced John so deep into the crevice that his chest was completely compressed. His exhausted heart, which had been fighting against gravity and lack of oxygen for nearly 24 hours, could not withstand the shock of the fall and the renewed, crushing pressure. A medical professional on the rescue team was eventually able to crawl down and maneuver a stethoscope through the tiny gap, pressing it as close to John's torso as possible. They listened in the agonizing silence of the cave. There was no heartbeat, no sound of breathing. Sometime in the late hours of November 25th, John Edward Jones had quietly passed away. The devastating news was relayed to the surface. The massive rescue operation, involving over 100 dedicated individuals, ground to a heartbreaking halt. The focus shifted from rescue to recovery, but they quickly realized the grim truth. It was too dangerous to retrieve his body. The rock was too hard, the space too tight, and the risk to the recovery team was simply too great. In the days following the tragedy, an agreement was reached between the Jones family, the landowners, and the local authorities. Nutty Putty Cave would be permanently sealed. They poured concrete into the entrance, locking away the dark, twisting tunnels forever. The cave was transformed from a site of weekend exploration into a permanent, silent tomb for John. This tragic event leaves a heavy, lingering silence in its wake. It stands as a profound reminder of the delicate fragility of human life and the irreversible nature of certain choices. Sometimes, driven by ambition, curiosity, or the simple belief that pushing harder will eventually lead to a breakthrough, we force ourselves into spaces we were never meant to occupy. We push forward into the dark, convinced the path will open up, only to realize too late that the walls have closed in behind us. True wisdom often lies not in the relentless drive to push forward at all costs, but in having the patience and humility to recognize our limits, to know when to stop, and to understand that some paths, once taken, offer no way back. Thank you for joining me on this descent into the dark. If this chilling reality left a heavy weight on your chest, just wait until you hear the entirely different kind of nightmare we have prepared for you next time. Until then, stay safe and always be mindful of where your curiosity leads you.